Welcome to Cinema in the Age of Ideology, a series in which we will explore the greatest films of the greatest ideologies of the 20th century. Beyond propaganda itself, how does cinema as an art form manifest the ideology in which it is circumscribed? This is Communism and Eisenstein, this is National Socialism and Riefenstahl, this is Cinema in the Age of Ideology. As an introduction to our series, what better film to start it than with Battleship Potemkin, the most famous and celebrated film and piece of artwork by Sergei Eisenstein. We will use this film as a primary exemplary to introduce the series in which ideology and cinema art form express themselves in our culture and in the history of cinema in a harmonious way. I will be joined by my friend Decadent Perspective to help us illustrate this example of artwork and ideology.
Thanks for having me on, Virgilius. And a privilege, I should say, and I look forward to discussing this landmark of cinema with you. Cinema and art are usually not seen together. However, cinema and politics are usually uh, often incomparable in regards to its effects on culture and entertainment. But what we're going to look at are the interesting uh, correlations between politics and art, or to be more precise, ideology and art in early cinema, particularly the cinema of what can be considered the most infamous regimes of the 20th century, which are the Soviet and National Socialist regimes. We will start first with Battleship Potemkin, a famous film and groundbreaking film in terms of its style and approach, especially in terms of montage theory, by none other than Sergei Eisenstein, called Battleship Potemkin.
Yes, the film is very straightforward. So it basically begins with the ship and ends with the ship. It is only about the ship. Initially, it was intended to be another part of, I think, an 8-part series of films about the 1905 Russian Revolution. So it is all pretty well contained. The film just lasts about 1 hour. We begin first with the discontent, which, as we will see in the Soviet art filmmaking, is of propaganda, is an usual method of portraying the ideology, as we will see later. We begin with the discontent of the sailors, especially over a quarrel of food which seems to be rotten and is full of maggots. The authorities of the ship seem to be unconcerned and indifferent about the
conditions of their workers.
Uh, yes, about the anger and the distaste the sailors feel about the food and the living conditions in the Potemkin itself. So we see the film as divided in these 5 parts, which have a central thematic to direct them. The first part simply shows the discontent, the distaste, the anger that is accumulated by the sailors, and the completely opposite indifference and authoritarian contempt about those claims and genuine feelings by the sailors. We immediately pass at the second part, which is called drama at the deck, which is the moment in which the authority is expressed with, as we will see, the only understood form of authority in the Soviet dialectic, which is force, authoritative force. Immediately, the officer corps of the Potemkin organizes punitive measures against the sailors. It is at this moment of tension and force in which finally the sailors respond as a group under the leadership of Vakulinchuk, which gathers all the sailors beneath the deck gun. This is a moment which we will later see and explain as a dialectic moment in the ideology of Soviet cinema and philosophy. The sailors finally respond to the organized authoritative measures of executing the dissident sailors. They organize themselves, but they make an appeal to the firing squad, in which they all unite together in this rebellion against the authority of the officer corps. They take the guns and assail violently all of the officers in the ship. eventually killing them or throwing them off the board. It is at this moment that Bakulinshkuk, initially as the leader of the revolt, is killed for the revolt, for the rebellion, for the mutiny. The sailors eventually triumph over the officers, but Bakulinshkuk is killed by another one. At which moment he becomes a martyr for the movement. We then come to Act 3. A dead man calls for justice. The sailors raise the status of Bakulinshkuk as the martyr of the mutiny and make a ceremonious act by placing them in a funerary way in the port of Odessa, in which the Potemkin is anchored. We see again a manifestation of public empathy. The body of Bakulinshkuk is almost enshrined by the people. It is scared, it is felt by all of them. It is also a moment in which the people start to, in a sense, unite and in another purge itself, united by the martyrdom of this new hero. The people of Odessa is thus united by this process, in which it manifests itself in another movement of empathy towards the mutineers. They gather at the port and send supplies to the ship crew. It is the first moment of victory and tranquility that is felt on the film. The dialectic is continued as the people of Odessa gather on the steps of a hill, contemplating the Potemkin. The Tsarist forces arrived impromptu, with force and impersonality. They form a firing line and start executing and shooting at all the innocent people gathered on the steps. That starts a frenzy, which will later become the famous and infamous Odessa step scene. As we will later see, is the prime example of Eisenstein's film method. The people is thus suppressed by the Tsars in a cruel and bloody way. The Potemkin organized themselves also in a warlike manner and start shooting at the theater of Odessa, in which the HQ of the Tsarist was established. The crew of the ship then get news that the Black Sea Fleet, which was loyalist to the Tsar, mobilized against them, to which they respond by sailing from the port of Odessa, now in flames. They sail from the port of Odessa, now in flames, to meet the Tsarist fleet. Okay, so we thus begin the fifth and final act of the film, One Against All, which becomes a duel between battleships and, of course, the crew of the Potemkin united in the struggle. In a moment of tension that increases exponentially, the battleships get closer and closer as the guns lower and start aiming at each other. And when they finally meet each other, we can only hear cheers and no cannon shots. The crew of the Potemkin is greeted by the sailors of the other ships as brothers and fellow mutineers, and they simply let them pass, finally ending in the Potemkin sailing to the horizon undisturbed and free, thus simply ending the film. And that's basically the film Battleship Potemkin in a nutshell. It's, as I said in the beginning, a very condensed film, a very simply structured film around the mutiny of the Potemkin. We will now briefly explore the context of the Potemkin itself and also of the film, the Battleship Potemkin, why it was made and what is the importance of the event and the film as a whole. Lenin said that the 1905 revolution was simply a dress rehearsal of the 1917 Bolshevik or October Revolution. So what we have in 1905 is simply a consequence of the state of the Russian Empire and what just happened, which was the Russo-Japanese War, which was a humiliation for Russia. Simply what was considered a Western superpower being defeated by an almost unknown third world power, which was Japan at the time. It was just about to create its own imperialism in 1905, the Japanese, I mean. By 1905, the Russian Empire was beginning to industrialize, so it was creating its new proletarian mass. Before that, it didn't have the problems of the proletarian uprisings and instability that, for example, France had. or Germany. He also created an intellectual class. There was a liberalization of the universities, of the schools. So what we see is something which would happen and repeat itself in Spain, in which we see an expansion of the intellectuals, which become also unstable and full of upheaval and anger, for example. So what happened is a terrible economical crisis and a defeat in a war, in which sparks which acts to as a catalyst to ventilate all the sensed oppressions of the Russian people and classes in what would be the 1905 revolution. Now, the consequence of this revolution is the creation of a parliamentary system and a constitution in Russia for the first time. And its direct correlative of this event, of this revolution, is the 1917 revolution, which happened more or less in the same context. The industrialization continued, the liberalization and growth of the intellectuals continued, and there was also a losing war, which was the First World War, which plummets the legitimacy of the Tsardom, and as we all know, it leads to the fall of the Romanovs and the rise of the Bolsheviks in October, and the Russian Civil War. Now, this is the context of the Potemkin itself. Now, the context of the film is just it is presented in 1925, just 3 years after the Russian Civil War, which is one of the worst civil wars that have ever happened in history. It was so bloody, so chaotic in its nature, and indeed long, like 5 years for a civil war. It's a bit long, which utterly destroyed and dismantled the Russian people. So at this moment, 1925, the Bolshevik regime, which has now total military control over Russia, has, in its own perspective, a sense of getting together the nation. And what better way to get the nation together than with propaganda? In which we will see how Eisenstein is so essential in this propagandistic contribution of national or Soviet unity. The Soviet peoples were almost in their majority analphabet. They were in the majority illiterate. So the methodology of Eisenstein to especially use images is so essential to this, because images are universal, they are timeless, they are beyond language.
Sergei Eisenstein, possibly the first great filmmaker of Russian cinematic history, next to Dovzhenko and a few others. But Eisenstein stands out the most, although he is often compared to other Soviet filmmakers in terms of their approach to the propagandistic aspect of Soviet society, such as Tsaga Vertov and his theory of the Kinopravda, the eye of truth, which was a sort of a documentarian portrayal of Soviet living. But Eisenstein is, as we've just been listening to about the story of just the story alone of Battleship Potemkin, that he approaches propaganda with a much more epic and romantic aspect to it, whereas others like Tsaga Vertov in his Kino Eye seem to want to portray an accuracy with that, whereas others like Tsaga Vertov seek to portray a Soviet society and culture with accuracy as well as solidarity amongst its citizenry and peoples. Now, although I have to say that I personally think Potemkin is probably his least interesting, Eisenstein, that is, his least interesting work. You can definitely see the influence and significance of that film. You can even say it was probably the birth of a nation of Russia. Birth of a Nation is an earlier film from D.W. Griffith. But that's another film entirely. But the film has a very interesting first attempt at Eisenstein's montage theory. Even though it wasn't his first attempt at cinema, I believe his first film was called simply Strike, which I think is actually a better film, but that's another film altogether. But Battleship Potemkin has there are many moments in it which the montage thing is really powerful. There's an instance in the beginning of the film where one of the workers is washing dishes and notices a Bible inscription, a prayer inscription that says, "Give us this day our daily bread," and but he has not had his daily bread, even though he's put dedication and effort and work and blood, sweat, and tears to get his pay, to get his daily bread, and he has not had his daily bread. And in a moment of fury and rage and revolt, he smashes it. But the way it's shot is magnificent. There are multiple shots of him just raising the glass, and multiple shots of him lowering it, and then finally smashing it to the kitchen counter. And this evokes an extremity of anger and passion and relatableness to the fury of revolt and the origin of striking and rebellion and revolution in itself. And of course, since it's just the workers, most people at the time could relate to that anger and relate to that fury. And it it also seems to be a sort of parody of the czarist authorities. You see that they're while they're uncaring, they also seem a little clumsy and ignorant of their surroundings. They seem to be of a whole other world, and they have like sort of menacing looks to them. They're conniving, but also dumb. It's there are all kinds of aspects to them. The
Yeah,
Eisenstein.
there's a thing beyond simply criticizing the authorities. It seeks only to beyond that. It seeks to delegitimize them and to deconstruct them. Simply change the perspective we have about them, changing the value we have of the idea of them, of the authority.
Indeed.
That is.
Indeed, especially. And then there's another brilliant sequence by Eisenstein when when the workers gather together and blow up the uh, the authorities' government opera house. And while it's blowing up, there are shots in between the explosions of statues of lions, which I suppose is supposed to be a symbolic of the unstoppable force of revolt and the point of no return, in a way, that we are finally an untamable lion. But I think
And
this
that
also.
shot, that shot, just a little observation. That shot, actually, I think it's 4 shots of the lion, and it begins like laying on the stone. But the final shot of the lion is standing. And it's interesting how that lion is sculpted because it seems like almost astonished. Of course, it doesn't mean that the lion is astonished because that's not the purpose of the sculpture. But in the whole Eisenstein's methodology, that progression of shots of lion makes a movement, a connection of ideas which by themselves have no connection. It's its whole methodology, and by the end, it seems that the lion is actually like energetic, like it stood over for the events that just happened.
Indeed, precisely. But what I found most striking about it was what it reminded me of. It reminded me of a moment in the film Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese, which is, to my eyes, the most accurate portrayal of politics in America. Watch Gangs of New York. There's a small moment in that film, later in the film, Gangs of New York, where the upper class New Yorkers are discussing the chaos in the streets and the riots, and they're rather nonchalant about it, rather uncaring. They think it's just a phase going on. But and as one of the upper class New Yorkers leaves the frame holds still on a statue of a lion, um, which I think also I suspect it might have been an homage to Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin in a way, because really shows that what I had just said about the, the Potemkin sequence, where it was a point of no return, and it was right before their eyes, kind of thing. I thought that was an interesting detail. I don't know if it was, much
Beyond being a
Eisenstein,
point
but it
of no,
really reminded me of that.
okay, beyond being the point of no return, even the end itself, it seems like the what's the expression? This ship has sailed. I mean,
Yeah.
the ship just just leaves to the horizon, and with the unity of the steel that composes the ship, representing being a metaphor of the revolution. That the ship just sailed and it went to the horizon. This progression of history, but but with this metaphor of the steel and of the ship itself, which is very interesting.
Yes.
One thing that many people seem to forget when viewing films is that nothing is accidental, especially with with filmmakers such as meticulous and methodological and scientific as Eisenstein. Nothing is accidental in this kind of filmmaking, at least.
Yes, as opposed to a lot of films today, where a lot of shots you see so many mistakes, so many inconsistencies, so many slip ups that oftentimes you notice. All right, and oftentimes you even seeing new theories of filmmaking to emerge that it is purposefully bad, purposefully inconsistent, purposefully ridiculous and uncaring. But indeed, with older filmmakers such as Eisenstein, especially in the silent film era, films had to be very, very blatant. They had to be they had to be as clarifying as possible. Um, but also, since they had very little at their disposal, they had to assume that primarily that the audience could connect the dots. And in order for them to do that, they had to show these explicit views. And you see in silent films, this is a lot of shots that are reminiscent of iconography. A lot of people in the same shots, a lot of events happening in the same frame. Um, but what was interesting about Eisenstein, it showed particular people, particular faces. It kind of reminds me of Carl Theodor Dreyer's film Joan of Arc, where there's a specific focus on the person and the face and the emotion and and all that. But what Eisenstein did, as opposed to Dreyer's, uh, he showed the individual emotions, and then one the shots next to that would be of entire peoples, that you are part of the people, that you are part of this revolution, saying that it's almost like a cinematic Uncle Sam, like a "I want you" kind of thing. And so I thought that was a very interesting approach that he made to that, and very effective, I would say as well. Although I think in today's cinema, the film would have been considered absolutely ridiculous. But uh, studying the film and its meticulous nature and its montage and the patterns and the themes, you can see its influence on cinema today in terms of what it wants you to think, how it leads you to that, and it's all done essentially in the editing, which in the end is the master of the whole craft.
You can actually sum up the shots, the close-ups of the faces, sum them up and actually construct the film in its thematic way. You have all the elements with their progression, with the close-ups, with the expression of the face, what they are meant to portray, which is very interesting. You can sum them up and they are a coherent whole. And as you said, this like collectivization, when an individual expresses itself, it is immediately put into the context of the whole. It is simply a pure Soviet or socialist way of expression. You know that painting, very famous painting, The Bolshevik by Boris Kustodiev, in which we see like this giant man walking above a Russian city, but he's just an expression of the little people which compose the mass which are walking in the streets. It is really interesting how Eisenstein connects those individual expressions which make up the film thematically with, I mean, successfully a successful synthesis with this concept of the group, of the whole, of the popular expression, the mass, of the proletarian.
Indeed. And I think what makes this film so groundbreaking, I think it was probably the first film to successfully merge ideology with art. And thus it
And
kind of laid
history.
the standards of all ideology and art in general.
Many don't consider the Battleship Potemkin a history movie or a historical movie, just a propaganda movie. I mean, indeed, it is a propaganda movie, blatantly, but it is also a historical movie. Every historical movie must show, in some way or another, a sense of ideology, of orientation, because if it's historical, done by the nation in which that historical event took place, it is necessarily a cause of what we are today, or of what that nation is in that day, in that moment in which it is making the film. But in the Soviet or Bolshevik context, in this materialism of history, in this necessary materialist causality and dialectic, such moments are simply the historical catalytic moments of history. It is a necessary moment. It is a direct causal moment. So it is actually a merging, in their eyes, a successful merging, which is not contradictory, of propaganda with history. It is completely legitimate in this case. Well, just another observation of Eisenstein's method of making a film, at least in this film, is that there are actually very few, next to none, uh, traveling shots, or indeed any kind of shot in which the camera itself is moving. They are all static. And again, this is not accidental. This is not necessarily a product of the times, 1925. Because by that time, there were a lot of camera movements already taking place. But Eisenstein chooses not to move the camera that much. Now, originally, this is film history, the camera isn't moved at all. It is just recording what would be a theatrical display. But here, the camera doesn't move, almost nothing, but there is not this theatrical display of the early films. It is this new method of making film, which is more personal. The close-ups, the more emphatically, with a connection of indifferent images to create a very partial whole.
I suppose I would like to say that although Battleship Potemkin is Eisenstein's most celebrated work in regards to the history of cinema, I think it's not necessarily his best, especially compared to his later films like Ivan the Terrible. Um, but nonetheless, its influence on sequence and montage is indisputable, I would say. And I think this is brilliantly expressed in the beginning of the film, with with the workers and the rot of the food. Um, there's a precision in regards to Eisenstein's detail and focus on the conditions and ideology, especially Soviet communist ideology. And thus ends our review and analysis of Battleship Potemkin. Next in the series, look forward to another Soviet film called Mother, a film released in 1926. If you want to know all about it, wait till our next review. It should be coming sometime soon.
Perfect. Thank you all very much for watching. Until next time.